In 1015-13, an Ottoman admiral drew a coastline that no human being was supposed to have seen for another 300 years. A southern landmass, sitting below the tip of South America, sketched with bays and river inlets and headlands. The problem is not that he drew it early. The problem is what he drew, because the coast on that map is not buried under ice. It is bare rock, open shoreline, the naked edge of a continent. And the continent it matches has been sealed under 2 miles of ice for millions of years. That map is real. It hangs in a palace in Istanbul. And for 5 centuries, nobody could explain how a coastline that has been frozen since before human civilization existed ended up on a piece of gazelle skin drawn by a man who never went anywhere near it. Most people walk right past this. A curious old map, a coincidence, an accident of a sloppy cartographer. But the admiral wrote his sources directly onto the parchment. He said he compiled it from older charts, much older charts, maps that were already ancient when he copied them. So the question stops being how did he know and becomes something colder. Who mapped that coast before it froze? And what else did they see down there? Because this is not the only anomaly pointing at the bottom of the world. There is a second map that shows rivers running through the interior. There is a lost expedition. There is a piece of physics that describes the ice sheet doing something it should not do. And there is a landscape under the ice that scientists have now confirmed with radar. A landscape that was carved by flowing water in open air, by something. This is the story of what is under the ice, why the maps knew about it first, and why every time someone gets close, the door quietly closes. Let me show you the map itself. It was drawn in 1013 by Piri Reis, a real admiral in the Ottoman Navy, and it was rediscovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace, folded into a bundle of forgotten parchments. What survives is only a fragment, about a third of the original. Europe, the west coast of Africa, the new coast of South America, and then, at the bottom, a landmass that curves eastward and runs off the torn edge. In 1956, a Turkish officer handed a copy to the U.S. Navy Hydrographic Office, and a cartographic engineer there named Arlington Mallory studied it and said something that started an argument that has never ended. He said the bottom of the map was Antarctica, not a distorted South America. Antarctica, specifically the coast of a region called Queen Maud Land. Here is why that should be impossible. Antarctica was not sighted by any known ship until 1820. Its true coastline, the shape of the actual land under the ice, was not mapped until the 1950s. And it was only mapped then with seismic instruments that fire sound down through the ice and read the rock beneath. The ice-free shape of that coast is invisible to the eye. You cannot see it from a boat. You cannot see it from a plane. You can only see it by looking through 2 miles of ice with modern equipment. And yet, the outline Mallory matched to those seismic surveys was already sitting on a map drawn 400 years before the equipment existed. Now, the mainstream answer. For decades, geographers dismissed the southern coast as a mistake, an exaggerated tale of South America that the mapmaker bent sideways to fit the parchment. That is the sober explanation. And it is not stupid. Old maps distort constantly. But that explanation has a problem. The bent coastline does not just vaguely resemble Antarctica. In places, it tracks the sub-ice shoreline, the bays and inlets that only exist under the glacier, with a fit that is hard to wave away as a lucky smear. And the admiral's own notes on the parchment say he was copying charts far older than himself. So either it is a coincidence that a random distortion happens to match a coastline nobody could see, or the old charts he copied were drawn when that coast was not yet frozen. There is no comfortable third option. That is the first clue. Now it gets stranger, because Piri Reis is not alone. In 1501, a French mathematician named Oronce Fine drew his own world map, and at the bottom of it he placed a giant southern continent. Not a smear this time, a recognizable landmass with mountain ranges, with coastlines, and with rivers flowing down through the interior to the sea. Rivers. Flowing water, cutting valleys across the land. A man named Charles Hapgood, a history professor at a small college in New Hampshire, spent years studying these maps in the 1960s. And he noticed that Fine's continent had its coast in roughly the right place and its center empty, exactly the way a real ice-free Antarctica would look. Water at the edges, high dry interior in the middle. Hapgood sent his analysis to the U.S. Air Force, to the cartographic squadron at Westover Base, and the reply he got back is the part nobody talks about. The Air Force cartographers agreed. They wrote that the geographical detail at the bottom of the map appeared to represent the actual sub-ice topography of Queen Maud Land, and that whoever the original source was, they had mapped it before the ice. That is not a fringe blogger. That is a military mapping unit putting it in writing. If you want to know what those rivers were cutting through and what is actually down there under the ice today, subscribe, because this channel goes into the sealed and the buried every single week. And this one is nowhere near finished. Because here is where the ancient maps and the modern instruments start describing the same thing. For most of the 20th century, you could argue the maps were fantasy, because nobody knew what the land under the Antarctic ice actually looked like. Now we do. And it is not a flat frozen plain. Starting in the 1950s and accelerating with ice-penetrating radar flown on aircraft, scientists have peeled the ice away digitally and mapped the bedrock beneath. And what they found is a hidden world. There is a mountain range down there the size of the European Alps, the Gombertsev Mountains, with peaks over 2.5 kilometers high, buried completely, never seen by a human eye. First, detected by a Soviet seismic team in 1958. Sharp peaks, deep valleys, and here is the detail that stops you. Sharp alpine peaks like that are carved by rivers and by mountain glaciers in open air. The topography is too jagged to have formed under a static ice cap. Something cut those valleys before the ice sealed them, and then the ice froze them in place and preserved them, like a body in amber, for 34 million years. And there is water down there. Not frozen, liquid. Beneath the ice near a Russian station called Vostok, radar and seismic surveys revealed a lake the size of Lake Ontario, sealed off from the sky for at least 15 million years, sitting under nearly 4 kilometers of ice. When Russian drillers finally reached the top of it in 2012, the water they pulled up carried genetic traces of thousands of organisms, life that had evolved in total darkness, cut off from the rest of the planet. And Vostok is not alone. There are nearly 400 subglacial lakes now mapped under Antarctica, linked by rivers that fill and drain on cycles, an entire hidden hydrological network, a drowned landscape of water and mountains and valleys, frozen over the top and running quietly in the dark. The old maps drew a continent with rivers and open coasts. The radar found the beds those rivers once ran in. Not similar, the same landscape. One drawn by hand 500 years ago, one imaged by aircraft in our lifetime. So how do you get an ice-free Antarctica onto a map at all? This is where the story reaches for its most extreme idea, and I want to be careful with it. In the 1950s, Hapgood proposed something he called Earth crust displacement, the idea that the entire outer shell of the planet can slip over the interior, sliding whole continents into new latitudes over a relatively short span. He argued that Antarctica had once sat in a warmer zone, ice-free, and possibly inhabited, and was then dragged to the South Pole and frozen. And the man who wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book endorsing the mechanism as worth serious attention was Albert Einstein. Einstein corresponded with this obscure professor and put his name to the theory before he died. That letter is real. Mainstream geology today rejects the fast version of crustal displacement outright. Plate tectonics moves continents at the speed your fingernails grow, Not fast enough to freeze a civilization, but strip away the speed, and a smaller fact survives that geology fully accepts. Antarctica really was ice-free. 50 million years ago, it was green. There were forests, palm trees grew there. The continent, at the bottom of every one of these maps, genuinely was, at one point in Earth's past, a warm and open land. The only fight is about when the ice came, and whether any eyes were there to see the coast before it did. Now, does this prove that a lost civilization mapped Antarctica before the ice, or that Atlantis lies frozen beneath Queen Maud Land? Probably not. And you should be suspicious of anyone who tells you it is certain. Every single piece has an ordinary answer if you want one. The Piri Reis coast could be a distorted South America. The rivers on Fine's map could be a lucky guess dressed up by a map maker filling empty space, because Europeans of that era assumed a great southern continent must exist, and drew it speculatively. The Gambritsev peaks were carved by ordinary ancient rivers tens of millions of years before any human walked the earth, not by anyone we would recognize. The subglacial lakes are natural, warmed from below by the planet's own heat. Take the clues one at a time, and each one dissolves into something mundane. That is true, and it matters. But here is what the ordinary story still cannot do. It cannot explain why two independent mapmakers in two different countries, decades apart, both placed a coastline at the bottom of the world that matches the shape of land no one could see. It cannot explain why a United States Air Force cartographic unit looked at one of those maps and confirmed in writing that it matched the sub-ice terrain. It cannot explain why the detail is not vague but specific. The right bays, the right interior, the rivers where the radar later found the valleys. At minimum, somewhere, encoded knowledge of a coastline that has been frozen since before recorded history, and passed it down through copied charts until an Ottoman admiral inked it in 1513 without understanding what he was drawing. Even the careful version of this is extraordinary. It means a map of a place no living person had seen was already old when the modern world was young. There is one more thing the ordinary story struggles with, and it belongs to the recent past, not the ancient one. In 1949, a joint Norwegian, British, and Swedish expedition set out across Queen Maud Land, the exact region Mallory matched to the map, and ran the first serious seismic survey of the ice sheet there. They fired sound down through the glacier and read the rock underneath, and the sub-ice coastline they measured, the true shape of the land beneath the ice, is the profile that was later laid beside the Piri Reis coast. Think about the order of events. A map drawn in 1513 sat unexplained for 4 centuries. Then, in 1949, a team finally measured the hidden coast for the first time in history, and only after that measurement existed could anyone see that the old map had been describing it all along. The map did not match the visible continent. It matched the invisible one, the one you can only find by looking through the ice, the one that was not confirmed until the middle of the 20th century. The admiral was 400 years early, and he was drawing the coast you cannot see. And the closer instruments get, the quieter things become. Piri Reis said he copied older charts, and those source charts have never been found. The library where such maps would have lived, the great collections of the ancient world, burned. Hapgood's crustal theory got him ridiculed out of serious academia, and after his death, his correspondence and files scattered. The lakes under the ice are sealed by international treaty, drilling restricted, samples tightly controlled, entire regions off limits to the kind of investigation that would settle anything. Every time someone reaches toward the bottom of the world, a treaty, a lost archive, or a professional reputation closes the door. The pattern is always the same. The evidence points down into the ice and the way down is always blocked. So we are left with a landscape we can see on radar but cannot reach. Mountains as tall as the Alps, standing in the dark. River valleys carved in open air by water that stopped flowing before our species existed. Lakes of liquid water sealed for 15 million years, holding life that evolved with no sun. And above all of it, 2 miles of ice. And on top of that, a thin skin of maps drawn by men who should not have known any of it was there. If even the cautious version is right, then our history is missing a chapter, a memory of a coastline preserved and copied and carried across thousands of years until it surfaced on a piece of gazelle skin in a palace in Istanbul. The maps are still there. The mountains are still there, buried and silent. The lakes are still sealed. The drilling still restricted. The source charts still lost. And under Queen Maudland, under 2 miles of ice, the coastline that Piri Reis somehow drew in 1513 is still down there in the dark, exactly where he put it, waiting for someone to be allowed to look. If you want to know what else the ancient world seems to have mapped before we were supposed to exist, watch the next investigation on screen right now.